Hi, welcome. You're listening to Maintaining Good Relations, live at 55 Walker Street, Artist Space. I'm Maria Hupfield with Native Art Department International.
Hi, and I'm Jason with Native Art Department International. This has been an ongoing project for maybe the last 2 years, although it's been in existence for closer to 5. And then we have our other co-host, Chris.
Hi, I'm Chris Green. I am the guest that will not leave. I'll be here all day with Native Art Department International talking about a variety of topics from Max Ernst to Standing Rock to the downtown art scene. It'll be a pleasure, and thank you, Maria and Jason, for having me with you.
Sure. Would you do me a favor? Tell me about, we opened with this flute song. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the first song we had on today's program was a song from a cassette tape by John Rayner Jr., and we're here in 55 Walker at Artist Space in the exhibition Unholding, which is in large part a tribute to a historically important exhibition called We the People that was at Artist Space in 1987. And the song by John Rayner Jr. was actually played by the curators of that show, Gene Fisher and Jimmy Durham, throughout the exhibition, and was kind of the live soundtrack, a series of cassette tapes.
Sounds great. Okay, so we're in the opening stages of this live stream, and we want to talk about, we want to give thanks to Artist Space for allowing us to do this program and for having this great exhibition and having it here. And we also have a guest. Would you introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Jamie Stevens. I'm the curator here at Artist Space and co-curator with my colleagues, the staff of Unholding, where we sit. Yeah.
Great. Would you spend a few minutes just talking us through this exhibition? I think, assuming I think Maria and I are very close to this exhibition. We've been involved several times coming up and seeing it, and also with the programming. But there may be people who may be confused by this, especially some of the omissions and some of the additions.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, maybe I can talk a little bit about how it first emerged as an idea. I mean, we're in a period of transition at Artist Space. We're kind of moving building. There's a new director who was appointed earlier this year. I myself, as the curator, have just been here for just over a year. And when Jay Sanders, the new director, came in, we were discussing how to use our time kind of, because at the moment, this where we are right now was our dedicated event space, and now is our primary venue. But we wanted to use this period as one where we both kind of enact and research. So how can we make projects where we're really building a kind of greater depth of knowledge about things that would nourish, our future program in the new building? And kind of two things conspired to make this happen. One was the passing away of Gene Fisher, and there was an idea that we would maybe hold some kind of memorial for Gene Fisher. We were both aware of the We the People project, which is the exhibition that she co-curated with Jimmy Durham in '87. And the other was just this desire to kind of really take on contemporary indigenous art practices and kind of initiate a whole host of conversations that could kind of be, maybe an events program, maybe an exhibition, we weren't quite sure. And in the end, what we decided was we wanted to make an exhibition that would be kind of quite simple and really like return to that We the People exhibition, but use that as a kind of model or a scaffold to host actually a whole new series of conversations with people, including yourselves. So, so the exhibition, in terms of what's in it, all the artists in the show were participants in We the People. In terms of how we edited it down, it really was about who was here in New York still, or who really was available to us, who it felt very kind of fluent to engage with what Artist Space is now, and that kind of organized itself in a very kind of simple manner, really. So what we have here are a number of works that are from the period of We the People, and also artists were invited to kind of contribute newer works or works they felt would complement those pieces. So yeah, I mean, that's like a very simple way in, but I guess a couple of other things to acknowledge are it really wasn't designed explicitly to kind of complement the Jimmy Durham show at the Whitney, and but of course it's an amazing time for contemporary native practices and being staged in New York, and obviously that's been something very interesting for me to recognize as a curator, as a contributor to the program here, is that there's such a great wave of energy around how contemporary art can kind of hold and contain some of like these questions and practices. So the timeliness of it is one that I think is felt far beyond kind of artist space into the field at large. And so we wanted to return to how artist space has played that kind of role in the past, not just with this particular issue, but with a kind of post-colonial lens in general, or sort of internationalism that I kind of pioneered at different points. So it really was both reflecting on the role and history of artist space, and also where we want to take it in the new building and reformulate our curatorial agenda moving forward.
That's great. Maria, did you have a question?
No, I just think it's really great to see a space that's committed to ongoing trust building, working with intergenerationally, with indigenous people. So it's really something that New York has this history, and to be able to pick that up yet again is encouraging.
So I mean, one really important kind of factor in the kind of curatorial work or research, or just the conversations that emerge in making a project like this, is that the lens of New York became so important. You guys were really strong on that and have engaged with the project. I know that that's something that feels important to you in terms of understanding how to triangulate like these kind of scenarios. And these practices are indigenous to New York contemporary art life as well. And I think that's one. That's been a very important kind of part of my learning process here. Is I'm also relatively new to New York, so understanding actually that there is like a deep history of, especially kind of self-initiated spaces and projects by kind of contemporary native practitioners. I mean, Amarinda did their book plot. I think you're going to explore this maybe later in the show, but that's been very inspiring. The intergenerational and New York kind of dimensions of all this.
Well, we're sitting here in the middle of the exhibition right now. We're surrounded by beautiful works, and Jamie, maybe you could just take a moment to mention the names of some of those, I want to say 80s generation artists that we're surrounded currently by, and some of the younger, newer generation of artists that are also contributing to the show.
Sure. So, I mean, maybe I can kind of do a rapid spoken walk through the exhibition. So, we kind of start the show with these three paper bags with drawings on them by Peter Jemison that are shown on plinths that kind of announce themselves as we walk through the door. Peter Jemison is someone who I think I've come to understand as a really critical figure in terms of Native American art practices in New York. He was, I believe, Chris, you're the one that maybe can correct me on this historical stuff, but I think Peter was the first curator at the American Indian Community House Gallery, and which was a very important space, I think from the late 70s. And when did it close?
Closed just recently, actually, in the 2000s.
The gallery itself has been gone for quite some time, but the community house itself is still around, right?
The community house still exists.
So in terms of health services and well-being services, that which is actually very critical to the community here, that's still here, but there is no gallery, so therefore there is no central focus point for indigenous artists who move to New York or want to get a foothold or want to find an access to the community. One of the things that we noticed was that it was difficult for, we would meet other indigenous artists who would come to New York, and if they didn't have our info by word of mouth, they actually became very unmoored very quickly, and their immediate goal was to then leave right away. So I think this is a very timely exhibition myself, because if anyone does travel here, at least they can see that New York does respond to the indigenous community in terms of programming and in terms of these kinds of exhibitions with acknowledging the history. And I think that's very important. There are many histories in New York City, and the indigenous community is just one of them, but it's also nice to be included in that sense.
Yeah.
And that's part of the historic import of We the People as a show in 1987. You mentioned Peter Jemison's work with the American Indian Community House Gallery, which I believe was around 77 to 1985 that he was the curator there. And he left to actually move upstate to the Ganondagan historical site, where he still works and still presides. A huge shift for him from a downtown art scene to upstate cultural center, which now has a beautiful museum. and a place for community. But before that, we have the history of Lloyd Oxendine, who in 1972 in Soho founded the American Art Gallery as another space. But Artist Space and We the People being you could call it a mainstream art institution, a very important institution for the contemporary art world downtown in the 80s, to have that opened up to many of these artists who were, in the case of Kay Walking Stick, having exhibitions at other mainstream commercial galleries, but many others were not. To have that available at the time was a major shift.
I agree. I think we need to move on. One of the things that we wanted to move on to was, we'd be remiss to not do a territorial acknowledgement at the start of this program. And so we're going to do our territorial acknowledgement conversation. Chris, do you want to, or Maria, do you want to lead us with that right now? Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. Well, actually, we have two special guests who we've brought here for this next section. I'm just wondering, before we get to that, did we want to
perhaps have our own hosts?
Yeah, I think our own hosts. Like, for example, I think we started a little early. This is one of those fun things with unscripted programming, where that segment with Artist Space was brought to you by Sam Durant's Scaffolds, which was buried at an undisclosed location by Lakota elders.
Thank you, Sam Durant Scaffold.
So I guess to usher in our next guests, we'll bring in who's our sponsor for that one, Chris?
Sponsor for our next segment is actually fracking. Fracking, wonderful tagline, why is the tap water on fire?
Okay.
Brought to you by fracking.
Great.
All right. So there's been much contested discussion around territorial acknowledgement. And one of the recent pleasures I had was participating in Movement Research Festival, which this year was called Invisible Materials by the curators Jonathan Gonzalez, Zev Mortarhan-Jo. Am I pronouncing that right?
Fave Marto-Harjano.
Thank you for that, EmmaGrace. So EmmaGrace, Skove-Epes.
Yeah.
So 3 curators who came together, and at the beginning of each segment, and of course it doesn't surprise me that dance, so when we're looking at arts and we're thinking about indigenous arts, that's something that has long included movement, dance, ceremony, song, all of these things interconnected and holistic. So of course, leading the way is this fantastic dance festival who, before each section, was doing this territorial acknowledgement. Can you share a little bit of that with me on how you came to this? What was that guiding idea behind that? I think it's really important when we see non-Indigenous organizations pick this up, this responsibility. And I think this is also very much connected to the festival and the overall vision of the work you've been doing there.
Yeah, so I'm Jonathan Gonzalez. I'm one of the co-curators. So Invisible Material, as it was titled, the Movement Research Festival for this past fall, was a kind of 3-headed, ambitious, week-long festival of performances and workshops and lectures, all kind of circumscribing this idea of working through alternative economies and working inside of the idea of making and how to make in the collective format. And so that already brings up a lot of mess in terms of the nostalgia of what it means to work collectively, and it kind of romanticizes, especially speaking to the history of New York City, what does a collective mean in terms of the history of this city. So we tried to provoke through the curatorial statement. I think, EmmaGrace, you fill in, it was a very ambitious gesture to try to understand how to produce maybe mess, to give many different kinds of collectives and formats an opportunity to just share their way of working together, which can maybe make a broader commentary on capitalism and the way that people are trying to imagine being paid for their labor, dreaming creatively, and also finding a way to create liberatory acts inside of the structures that be. So that is just the umbrella of what the festival was itself. And then I think this idea of territory and land acknowledgement really came through the artists that were inside of the festival that had been curated, specifically through Collective States, who had made it aware to us that there was already through Well, do you want to speak to this a little bit further? But yeah, there was already a format to kind of understand. Speaking to this, Dance Space Project, St. Mark's Church is the location where we held a few performances as a site of worship. We started our first kind of acknowledgement of land and territory of the Lenni Lenape people of that site, which is very specific when you speak to New York and the settlement of spaces of worship and how they have a very long and contentious history in terms of how they've made their acknowledgements. So I think we were trying to work through undoing as we were partnering with institutions as curators and organizers.
And just to add on, as Jonathan said, it was kind of a very ambitious week. We knew that there would be many gaps kind of in our visioning. We were not kind of trying to work with this idea of collective as a romantic one, more so to kind of bring different collective ways of working to the forefront to kind of witness and learn, see what questions and problems rose to the surface. And as Jonathan said, it was through one of the collective states members already into our programming. Roshana Zumberg kind of brought to our attention the kind of explicit ask from the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture to have this kind of land and territorial acknowledgement. So it was through word of mouth and through kind of the process of curating and being in the room with people that we came to make this decision and even learn that existed. We were not aware that it existed, despite, I think, would have absolutely had the intention to do so had we known so.
I think a lot also to speak to it, I think that was the way we were working as curators as well, trying to understand being in a kind of opacity with the artists who were involved inside of the festival and hoping that they can make aware to us other ways of being responsible, because we are also artists and not working primarily as curators, and I think we're using a very loose definition for that role.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Okay, and there were also a few different, for each, every time you had the territorial acknowledgement, there are a few different things that you were trying to hit each time. Can you go over some of those?
Yeah, so Zave was using this Honor Native Land, a guide and call to acknowledgement, as kind of a, what's the word I'm looking for? Sorry, a template, thank you.
Yeah, which I should say is available online at the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture. It was recently released for public use.
And so Zave would begin by stating that, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge that we are on occupied territory. This is currently an occupation. It's not an event of the past. And then to kind of name specifically that we are on Lenni Lenape land. And then also talked about kind of the renaming of the land, and would kind of offer different facts from their research each night. And we also, just to say, like, land acknowledgement, kind of as we know, is just an opening to a conversation, hopefully to a much longer and deeper one. But we did feel it was important to.
Yeah. So, that was great. Thank you. One of the things, the conversations that I've had with other Indigenous artists about land acknowledgements is that its intentions are, I think, initially good, but they are problematic. And one of the things that's been brought up is that while you're honoring the original inhabitants of this place, that it ignores the current inhabitants of this place and those of us who are Indigenous. For example, New York. I've been to so many events where they honor the Lenni Lenape. I'm here as part of the Native community here. What about those of us who are from somewhere else? And also, it also kind of freezes, and I have a specific example from my own home territory. I'm from Texas, and up until about 1760, those particular territories were Apacheria. And then around 1760, the Comanche moved in from Wyoming, and now it's considered Comancheria. And I wonder, if the rule then is if we're going to honor the Comanche, which is great, then it seems to me that it locks in the point of contact, right? Oh, let's honor these people who were here at this exact moment, as opposed to anyone else who came here before and anyone else who has come in after. What kind of responses have you had when doing these kinds of acknowledgments, do you feel that there's a kind of debate that can be open for this, or we're just looking for ideas?
I think it's important to say, well, firstly, all of that is very important to raise, I think, being aware moving forward. But, I think looking back at honoring native land, looking back at this template, we're beginning a very superficial layer of a much more intimate and comprehensive process for making this conversation occur inside of institutions and the access that they hold for artists and the continual erasure around this conversation, right? So we decided to create what is just the first step, which is just the proposal of naming through language that this exists, this erasure, which is obviously a contentious relationship to how language is a very violent process that is part of the colonial settler project that has done violence around the world and continues to do violence in this country and this nation. But that was just a way to kind of speak to the existence of what was in a fixed position of time, as you say. What is in terms of the settlement of the St. Mark's Church, what existed there prior. But obviously, when you start to create and you give time, I imagine, if we had the time to be able to commit to that, to understanding who are the people, who are the elders specifically, and then who are those who are located currently, who we have the opportunity to be in conversation with, who can come and speak comprehensively. I think we didn't actually have, maybe other than that one evening, the matinee where we heard someone speak back to Zave about, I don't know if you recall what this was, but speaking back about what they felt about the land acknowledgement. Other than that, there wasn't really intense conversation. It felt like it was the iceberg cracking for the first time in these spaces for many audiences, for a downtown, avant-garde, primarily white audience, that there was a sense of kind of rubbing up against their comfort zone. I definitely saw the faces, but not enough courage to start a discussion, I would say.
No, and I think another piece of it is in no way by doing a territorial acknowledgement do we want to position ourselves as people who know we are in a process of learning and a major process of kind of acknowledging the relationships that haven't been built. And I think also saying, it feels to me like it brings up the question of when is kind of publicly acknowledging something as a starting point of a conversation, putting ourselves in a position to be held accountable so that kind of through publicly stating we can start these conversations and ideally continue the relationship building that is important to the depth of the questions that you're bringing up. But then when is it that, we also have more work to do that we haven't done, and that is a revealing moment, absolutely. But to speak to the instance Jonathan was talking about, are you speaking to when someone in the audience came up and asked if Zave was Indigenous, which they are not. But it was interesting to see that there was this response immediately to say, oh, someone kind of leading a territorial acknowledgement must be Indigenous.
Must be involved in this genealogy in this very specific way.
Right,
Yeah.
and that was their reasoning for why that would be done.
Thank you, EmmaGrace. I mean, with your own practice around movement and the ideas of taking up space, multisensory listening, giving credit, intentions, I can see that this really crosses over in a multidisciplinary way. And I think that's one of the things I really appreciated about the festival was that not only was there dance, but you had a series of workshops, you had many, many things that were happening as forms of other types of research where you were really looking to be responsible, but also, how to respond and pick up some of these conversations. So even though this year I heard it, I also heard it last year in a different form. So it's been interesting to see that evolution. And I think it's not something that you see in the Indigenous community here in New York. And I think it's very contentious, and it speaks to what Jason's talking about. Individuals like Jolene Rickard talks about New York being a crossroads, that there are many different nations that were here. So to look at one is very, really, it's very Western.
Essentializing, exclusive, etc.
Yeah.
And the important factor of dynamism and being open to change and working through these acknowledgments is part of acknowledging that land, like Jason said, was never frozen. These relationships to place have never been frozen. They've always been changing, and indigeneity is distinguished by its special relationship to place and land, which often comes through stories of migration and stories of especially the history of that relationship, or place and land relationship, is one that has continuously evolved and strengthened rather than been stuck in a often romanticized past. And that's also something we have to relate to the public, and the public that is being, that these acknowledgements are often being directed to. In New York and America versus Canada, there's so little knowledge of not just whose land you might be on, but the history of it, the repeated exchanges of control that have happened, the palimpsest of land and treaty and territory that occurs. So while in Canada, many of our colleagues have a deep cynicism towards land acknowledgements, especially from institutions, in the U.S. there's so much context to still build, as you both nicely said, so much work to be done with not just the supposedly educated liberal audiences that we deal with, but amongst the just mass populace in general, which starts from very simple telling people what has occurred. And like you said, ice breaking is a wonderful way of putting it, breaking this kind of facade of a pre-held knowledge of what someone's own relationship to land is, and just troubling that. So that dynamism that interaction creates seems still extremely important, despite some pushes to rethink or challenge it.
I also appreciated the way that in your acknowledgement that you were really, it served to remind audiences that their understanding of land and land ownership and territory might differ, that you took it a step further to mention the cultural linguistic group of the Algonquin. So you're bringing up language, and then also the Lenni Lenape as Delaware. So, and then at the very end that you had a note to take a moment to let it sink in before the next announcement. So I think there's also this educational kind of component that happened, and I think that differs quite a bit than at Dance Space, where I heard Mikal and Mike D'Angeli speak from the Shimsham Nations. Mike is also Niska in Tlingit, and I'm going to pronounce this one wrong, Tisset. But when they came, and I asked them specifically about territorial acknowledgement, they said it really was a way that nation to nation that we addressed territory as inviting each other, forming hostile relations. So it really was about relationship building and respect, and so a lot of the language around that was informed by that. So if we're looking at over here, where we're not on the West Coast, that moment of contact, it was a different point in time that we're also looking at, and that history of dispossession and displacement is different, then the language around that may also be different.
It makes you wonder how useful, since we have it sitting on the table here, the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture, such a broad brushstroke for acknowledgement. You mentioned it was a template, of which, of course, it is, and it calls on engaging very individualistically with a particular place, but also makes you wonder if there can be a template for land acknowledgement, period, given some of those differences that Maria just described between points of contact.
I worry about the use of the word template, because then things become rather automated. I prefer these things to be grounded in more in sincerity, I think, and thought, and as opposed to just a rote step somewhere. And I often wonder that, and I worry that these land acknowledgements, we're at a point now where if we're driving this to becoming that kind of thing, oftentimes.
So there's a problem if I program Amazon Echo to spout out a land acknowledgement to wake me up in the morning. Like, good morning, Chris. You're on Lenni Lenape territory. You have shopping to do today. You have an appointment at 10.
Well, I think that was, I think that, just to reiterate what Maria was saying, why Zabe was making sure to kind of make that last note of holding the space for silence, rather than to produce a kind of rote script that felt like it didn't want to become internalized. to also have like an actual feeling about the issue and to give silence to that, especially in a performative space where sometimes has this autonomy of just already existing with all this artistic energy and not having to do anything with what happens outside of its walls. I think to break that immediately at the start of a show and to imagine ourselves already implicated. But obviously, we begin a conversation on the level of speech, but then you have to create actual pragmatic steps to have an intimate engagement.
I agree with you on many things, but it's also, I find appealing. One of the things I've often thought about is, in practice, when we do the territorial acknowledgements, they often are met with silence, a kind of solemn thinking and thought process. I wonder what would change if instead we tried to drive, anyone else, maybe to end that with applause. I mean, how do you think, in terms of performance, there's been a lot of, and there's another performance artist in the room, when we've often had conversations about the whole violence of applause thing, where at the end of a performance, how it can completely disrupt something. And I don't know, what are your thoughts about maybe ideas on not ending with silence, but ending with something else? So how do you think that would play out?
Something else other than applause also, or?
Other than silence. Which may not be, you may not think is appropriate, but still.
Jason, you're not on the mic. Can you move closer to the mic, please, my dear, and repeat your
I guess
question?
just to distill the question down is what are your ideas if we decided to change things up and start ending territorial acknowledgements with applause or laughter or something else?
Or tears.
Or, I wonder, okay, so I have three things in my head at the same time because I was so stirring. But, I think about the history of performance and applause as a kind of act of violence also. Like, I'm thinking about, like, prior to the French Revolution, the applause that, in thinking of those who were of lower class clapping for higher classes, they were, encircled and kind of dancing and enjoying this kind of leisure time, and those who were of the working class applauding the act of a kind of a sociality. So I wonder how much that does in a culture like ours, where a kind of noble listening, which is what we were thinking about throughout the course of the week, is not practiced in our culture. So much is embolstered by this idea of kind of taking up space with language and using language as weaponry. So the act of applause almost seems to fall in line with that. It feels like a kind of merriment in order to not reflect, And especially in the act of performance, there's something that becomes very inundating about applause that doesn't have to do with actually critically sitting with the moment. Silence can be very vulnerable. Yeah.
Right. Applause makes me think of spectatorship and who gets to participate in what ways and how that exists all over, but especially in these kind of performance spaces in which people still use the metaphor of a blank canvas to project their own realities onto the space without acknowledging what was there before. And I mean, there was actually applause after our matinee show. There was applause after every single announcement, but Zave's territorial acknowledgement was the first, and there was applause. I think in terms of the scope of the whole festival, kind of another thing that we were interested in is how in this performance space in which people are so often getting to being kind of able to participate to their degree of comfort, sitting back and applauding if they want. How can we use these as gathering spaces to be in the space together and to actually kind of energetically shift it, whether that is as witness or performer. And so kind of open the festival with a silent walk that we did throughout the kind of dance space as a way to kind of tap into how can we physically listen to this space. For me, it also brings up questions around different histories of naming and how, what I think, Jason, I hear you saying a little bit is that in the way that territorial acknowledgement can become rote, I feel like there is this very white, culturally white and Western kind of way of using naming or using language as a way to say oh, now I know this thing, so now I kind of own that knowledge in a way that is a kind of disembodied way of engaging. So I think we're really still thinking about kind of how to shift so that people can not just sit for a moment, but really be kind of holistically and physically taking in this information.
And also how with the festival that you really positioned it as a space to gather and reflect through action. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the ways that you describe that action, or the way the action took shape in the different programs that were part of the festival, or
Yeah, it's a dense question to go. It's also the process of going back 2 weeks. Well, I think there's the global look at what the week was doing, and thinking about the kind of interconnectedness of actions that happen across groups that are involved. You know, we began the week with a group that is called the Skeleton Architecture, which is a group of women and female-identified women of color. And they opened the space at Judson Church with a kind of invocation, a performance of events that really pushed against the conventions of even seeing work. All the audience were positioned inside of the performance space. It felt much more like a gathering that was trying to fly away from the stage and go somewhere else. And the kind of threads of that continued into the week with workshops that were asking, how do cultures collaborate? How does appropriation get met inside of the practice of art making? And especially as individual artists, refining a practice, or what is the idea of practice making? And those questions kind of continued to happen as we dealt with groups like Collective States that were asking very literal questions around translation. You know, they presented a piece where 3 artists who did not choose in the work to speak English spoke in their mother tongue, which was Spanish, while there was a translator. So audiences were in the experience of losing a lot of what the work was about, because the translation was not available to them at some points. And so those actions do something between each other in terms of the artist, and also between the audience in that liminal space of trying to understand what the festival is supposed to do for them.
Right.
And we were hoping by the end to lose a clear goal, which in some ways feels very westernized, right? To walk away and feel like we did good. As curators, we did good. As audience, hopefully to arrive at a place of a very dynamic chaos. Or defragmentation, maybe that's better.
Right, and really to have audiences be kind of in a place of questioning, like, when are they centered and why? And right, in this example of Collective States, kind of when is the withholding of information a really powerful act?
The unholding.
Yes. And, you know, even if you are paying a $15 ticket, that there is still a legacy, a huge legacy that kind of we are up against in terms of this moment of being able to kind of sit with what don't I know and what is or isn't for me, and who and how can this moment be for the performers, regardless of my paying to be here.
Well, it was definitely wonderful. Like, after that introduction, I didn't feel a moment of silence in my heart. I felt a moment of like celebration and cheer and like totally like, what is going on here? Like really, really excitement and to see it an ongoing thing that was happening. For sure.
Social Health Performance Club was lovely. It was great to have.
Well, we'll be speaking later on in the program with actually one of the original founding curators of Social Health Performance Club, Esther Neff, although she may not identify as a curator for that collective, based out of Brooklyn. So thank you both very much for joining us in this conversation around territorial acknowledgement. It's definitely a fraught one. It's one we're working through in the community here, in the Indigenous and non-Indigenous, the arts, trying to figure that out ourselves.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. Yeah, hope to continue the conversation too.
Looking forward.
Thank you both. So if we transition that to bring back some of the institutional hosts of this program, if perhaps our good friend, the curator, Jamie, returned And I'm eyeing if Jay wants to join us from the
Jay.
window side, perhaps.
Shout into the mic.
Freshly available. Joined also by Jay Saunders, the director of the wonderful institution Artist Space. Just to think, and Jay, on Wednesday at the program, you entered the role of territorial acknowledgement. Was that one of the first times that you had conducted a territorial acknowledgement as was written that evening? I noticed a certain different tone to it on Wednesday.
Yeah, both. I mean, for myself, yeah, that was the first time I've read a territorial acknowledgement, and it was structured in a way to participate in the program that Zach Khalil, Adam Khalil, and Jackson Paulus organized. So it played a role of kind of opening itself but not resolving until the end of their show, and became a kind of, in a way, I thought, like a preamble for the program that they enacted.
Yeah, and certainly had a sense of asking those questions of how to keep things uncomfortable, how to keep things open-ended, how to keep conversations continuing, and the intention of avoiding any easy institutional answer and kind of rote automatic acknowledgement certainly came out in that acknowledgement that you read.
And I thought, I mean, the language, I mean, it was very, I thought it was sort of very poignantly written. I know that in some ways they worked with like standard language or some, you know, some like ready-made articulation, but then to kind of, I don't know, to see the apology also as something that closes down and moves on and sort of resolves, and then the program can occur. I thought the openness of it was really poignant. And then, of course, Jim Fletcher played a kind of particular role, which had something to do with the, you know, the role he was asked to play, but also a role he played a couple years ago in a different context.
Yeah.
So that, you know, that apology,
that role.
that apology shifted and kind of moved into other, you know, for him.
Yeah, to have an acknowledgement shift into an apology is really a different kind of act and a powerful one in many ways. And I wonder, sitting here in the exhibition, if the art on display has a role in that kind of territorial acknowledgement or in unsettling this particular place. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, actually, let me just tack on to that. I would wonder if just simply having indigenous presence can act as a territorial acknowledgement unto itself, just simply by inclusion without having to go through any kind of spoken ceremony at the beginning. And what, you know, maybe there's a way to expand a territorial acknowledgement beyond just speaking literally about it.
In the sense of physical occupation with the body, or participation,
or just works
works.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess, you know, this show started with many, many conversations, and we didn't know what form this would take. We didn't know if it would be a single event, a series of events, and then it kind of took shape, you know, as it was, but really implicitly through like developing discussions. And I think one thing that, and Jamie has, you know, probably his own thoughts about this, but one thing for me that became clear, and maybe Jason, you're hinting at this, is like actually like sheer visibility, sheer presence, sort of work, speaking, being up on its own terms has like incredible power. And so that we did feel like that just, you know, the presence of this work is a lot, you know. So yeah, maybe that's a bit what you're saying, like there is a kind of, yeah, just like that level. I mean, it's like the project that Alan and Jackson were working on with the title Scales of Visibility that you were part of too. I mean, the visibility is a big, you know, they're very complicated, big term. So yeah, there was some fundamental to that.
I think also like the effect of those acknowledgements is contingent upon where they're happening, right? So I mean, my understanding is, say in Canada, it might be a much more familiar way to begin a kind of cultural event, and we can quickly, like in the discussion that we just had, we can find some problems, whether that's like essentialisms or whether it's a kind of letting the institution itself off the hook, kind of, and putting it into the good position or whatever. You know, all that, all those risks are there. But actually, I am unfamiliar with these acknowledgements being at the outset of an event. It would be interesting to know what that acknowledgement might mean in a different context, even like a non-native context for Artist Space or something like this. But also the thing about Jay's reading on Wednesday is that, you know, it literally was a script. It was part of the script of the performance. And thinking about Adam and Zach and Jackson's event, he did this really good job of kind of holding this contradiction of the whole thing being scripted, performative, but actually genuinely providing an example, a space in which I think different audience members coming with different levels of knowledge and interest and experience were able to connect and convene. And they were very good at being both kind of arch and earnest in turn.
A really different sense of the term scripted in this case, from not so automatic as part of a active, scripted and activated role for that acknowledgement. So, Maria, are you going to take us away on this segment?
Oh, so this segment, I guess, let's just go with Artist Space Part 2, is brought to you by Guam, whose tagline is, "It's always the colonies that get threatened with nuclear annihilation."
It's always the colonies.
Always the colonies, that's true.
That's unfortunate. But I think that we're going to close off this segment on Starting From Zero with some tunes curated by our local disc jockey, Marie Hupfield.
Harry Burke.
Technical assistance from Harry Burke.
Staring down the barrel of a gun.